In the spring of 1901, a small crew of Greek sponge divers, working their way home across the eastern Mediterranean, was driven by a gale to shelter in the lee of a bare and lonely island, and while they waited out the weather, one of them went down into the deep water to see whether the sponge beds there were worth the trouble. He was gone a long time. When at last he broke the surface, hauled back into the boat and stripped of his heavy copper helmet, his shipmates found him pale and trembling, and the words that came out of him were words about the dead. He had seen, he said, a heap of naked bodies lying on the seafloor, men and horses and women rotting in the green gloom, arms and legs scattered across the sand. The captain, a practical man, thought the diver had breathed bad air and gone out of his mind, and so he put on the helmet and went down himself to look, and when he came back up he was carrying, in one hand, the corroded bronze arm of a statue. The bodies on the seafloor were not the dead. They were older than any dead the men had ever imagined. They were sculptures, marble and bronze, an entire cargo of them tumbled and broken across the bottom of the sea, the freight of a great ship that had gone down in a storm some 2,000 years before, on its way from the old workshops of the Greek world toward the hungry markets of Rome. And among that cargo, though no one on the boat that day had any way of knowing it, half hidden in the sand and the shell crust and the ruin of centuries, lay the single strangest object the ancient world has ever handed back to us. Good evening and welcome back. Tonight I want to tell you the story of that object, the thing that came up out of the sea near the little island of Antikythera, because it is, I think, the most quietly astonishing survival we possess from the whole of antiquity, and because the shape of its story, the long sleep and the slow waking, is exactly the shape of a story to fall asleep to. It is a mystery, but a gentle one, with no violence in it once the storm has passed, only patience and puzzlement, and the very slow triumph of curiosity over time. So let me tell you what they found, and how long it took anyone to understand it, and why even now, with all our machines and all our light, a part of it keeps its silence. Here is the thing itself, as plainly as I can set it before you. Imagine a lump of bronze and rotten wood about the size of a large book. A shoebox, perhaps, if the shoebox had been crushed and left in the sea for 20 centuries. Green with corrosion, split and swollen, crusted over with the hard grey deposits that the sea lays down on everything it keeps. If you had walked past it on a table, you would not have looked twice. It would have seemed a broken piece of something, a fitting from the ship, a bit of ruined statue, a nothing. And inside that unpromising lump, hidden from every eye for 2,000 years, and hidden for a good while longer even after it was lifted into the daylight, there was a machine. Not a simple machine, not a lever or a wedge or a wheel on an axle. A machine of interlocking toothed wheels, gears, dozens of them, cut from thin bronze with tiny triangular teeth, meshing one into the next. Wheels within wheels, mounted on axles, turning at different speeds, arranged behind a face marked with scales and pointers, the whole apparatus built to be turned by a small handle on the side. Turn the handle, and the pointers moved. And what they showed you, as they moved, was the sky. The position of the sun against the stars, the phase of the moon, waxing and waning in a little rotating ball, half silver and half black. The wandering of the planets, the dates of eclipses, years in advance. The turning of the great calendars by which the Greek world ordered its festivals and its games. It was, and I choose these words carefully because they are almost too large to say quietly, a computer, an analog computer made of bronze built by hand more than 2,000 years ago to model the heavens and to predict their motions, and then lost, and then forgotten so completely that when it came back into human hands, the human hands did not know, could not know, what they were holding. Nothing else like it survives from the ancient world. Nothing else like it survives from anywhere in the world for more than 1,000 years afterward. When the mechanism went down with that ship, it took a whole way of thinking down with it, and the darkness closed over the wreck, and the centuries went by, and no one built its equal again until the cathedral clockmakers of medieval Europe, 1400 years later, and even they did not build anything so subtle. So that is the object we are going to sit with tonight, you and I, a shoebox of green bronze that turned out to hold the sky. Settle in. Let your shoulders come down from around your ears. There is nothing you have to solve here, nothing you have to remember, no test in the morning. We are simply going to keep company with a very old and very beautiful puzzle, and if you drift off somewhere in the middle of it, the machine will not mind. It has been patient for 2,000 years. It knows how to wait. Let me take you back to that storm and to that boat, because the human story of the discovery is worth telling slowly, and it is a good deal stranger than a museum label ever lets on. The men on that boat were not archaeologists, they were sponge divers, and sponge diving in that age was one of the hardest and most dangerous trades a man could follow. They came from the islands of the southern Aegean, from communities that had harvested sponges from the seafloor for as long as anyone could remember, first by holding their breath and diving naked with a stone to carry them down, and later, in that generation, with the new and terrible gift of the diving suit, the heavy canvas dress and the great copper helmet fed with air pumped down a hose from the boat above. The suit let a man go deeper and stay down longer than any breath-hold diver could dream of, and it killed him for it. They did not understand then the sickness that comes from rising too fast out of deep water, the way the body, saturated with the pressure of the depths, will fizz and cramp and cripple and kill if it comes up too quickly. They called it, when they spoke of it at all, simply the diver's disease, and it took a fearful toll on those crews, the strongest young men coming up paralysed or dying in agony on the deck, or living out their days bent and broken. So these were brave men, and hard men, and men intimate with the sea in a way almost no one is now, and it was one of them, working at a depth that we would today treat with enormous caution, who came up white and shaking with the news of the dead on the seafloor. The island they had sheltered under was Antikythera, a scrap of rock between the larger island of Kythera and the wild southwestern cape of Crete, sitting squarely in the old sea road between the Greek lands and the west. It is a place of almost nothing, a few hundred people at most in a good year, steep and dry and battered by the winds that funnel through that strait. The divers had not meant to be there at all, the gale had put them there. And so the whole of what follows, the entire recovery of the most sophisticated object of the ancient world, hangs on a storm that blew a sponge boat off its course on a particular week in a particular year, and on the curiosity of a captain who, instead of sailing on when the weather cleared, decided that a seafloor full of bronze arms was worth remembering and worth reporting. His name was Kondos, and when he got his crew and his cargo of sponges safely back to their home island, he did a thing that many a finder of sunken treasure, before and since, has not done. He told the authorities. He went to the government in Athens, and he described what he had seen. The statues lying on the seabed off Antikythera, and the young Greek state, poor as it was, proud as it was of the ancient inheritance that was the very reason it existed, listened, and so began, in the autumn of that year, the first great underwater archaeological recovery in history. Think of what that meant in that age. There was no such thing as a diver archaeologist. There was no equipment made for the careful lifting of ancient things from deep water. There was only the sponge crew, the same men, hired now by the state and working alongside the navy, going down in their heavy suits to a depth of perhaps 45-50 metres, a depth at the very edge of what those suits could survive, into water cold and dark and full of the tilting, half-buried shapes of the wreck. They worked in short shifts because they had to, a few minutes at the bottom, and then the long careful business of coming up, and even so the sea took its price. One of the divers died in the course of the work. 2 more were crippled by the diver's disease and never dived again. Men gave their bodies, quite literally, to bring these things up into the light, and I think that is worth pausing on, because it is easy, standing in a bright museum gallery, to forget that everything in the cases came from somewhere, and cost something, and that this particular treasure was paid for in the ruined joints and the lost life of men whose names are mostly forgotten. What they brought up over the months of that first campaign was a wonder in itself, quite apart from the machine. Bronze statues, some of them among the finest that survive from the ancient world, including a young man of heartbreaking beauty, standing, one arm raised, that scholars still argue over, whether he is throwing something, or holding something, or reaching for something no longer there. Marble figures, worn by the sea into soft ghosts of themselves, the parts that had lain buried in the sand still crisp, while the parts that had stood exposed to the water and its creatures were eaten smooth. Glassware and pottery and coins and jewellery. The ordinary rich cargo of a ship carrying the plundered or purchased art of the Greek East toward the villas of wealthy Romans. It was by any measure one of the great archaeological hauls, and the statues went to the National Museum in Athens and caused a sensation, and the machine, the lump of green bronze about the size of a book, was set aside. Of course it was. Put yourself in that museum in that year. You have before you some of the most beautiful bronze sculpture ever made, faces and bodies of astonishing skill, and you have a small corroded mass of nothing much, cracked and swollen, that looks like a piece of the ship's fittings gone to ruin in the sea. Which do you study first? The lump sat. It sat, in fact, for the better part of a year in the museum in Athens, along with everything else recovered from the wreck, while the scholars gave their attention to the statues, and while the lump itself, drying out slowly in the air after 2,000 years in the sea, did the thing that waterlogged wood and corroded bronze do when you let them dry. It split. It fell apart along its own hidden seams. And when it fell apart, someone, and the accounts differ a little on exactly who and exactly when, looked down at the broken pieces and saw, in the fresh green face of the break, the unmistakable form of a gear wheel. A wheel of bronze with teeth cut around its edge. Inside a lump from a 2,000-year-old shipwreck. Now I want you to understand how impossible that was, or rather how impossible it should have been, according to everything anyone thought they knew. Gear wheels in the year 1902 meant machinery, and machinery meant the modern age, or at the very oldest it meant the clocks of the late medieval cathedrals, the great iron and brass movements that struck the hours in the towers of Europe from the 14th century onward. The ancient world, in the confident understanding of that time, did not have gears. The Greeks were philosophers and poets and geometers, brilliant with the mind, yes. But the working of metal into precise machinery, the whole idea of the mechanism, the engine, the clockwork, that was ours, that was modern, that belonged to us, and not to them. The Greeks thought we built. That was the story, and it was a comfortable story, and it was wrong. Because here, in this green fragment, was a gear wheel, cut by a Greek hand at least 100 years before the birth of Christ, and it was not alone. As the pieces were examined, it became clear that there were many wheels, a whole nested train of them, and inscriptions too, tiny Greek letters engraved on the surviving surfaces, and pointers and scales. The first scholar to look at it seriously, an archaeologist named Spharonos, and then others after him, understood at once that this was something extraordinary and something that did not fit, and the arguments began, and they have in one form or another never entirely stopped. Some in those early years could not accept it. It was too advanced. It must, they said, be an intrusion. Something modern that had fallen into the wreck site later, a piece of a ship's instrument, a fallen anchor mechanism, anything but what it appeared to be. Surely the ancient Greeks could not have made a geared calculating machine. Surely, but the inscriptions were ancient Greek, in an ancient hand, and the style of the letters could be dated, and the coins and pottery of the wreck placed the sinking firmly in the 1st century before Christ, and slowly, reluctantly, against the grain of everything they had been taught, the scholars came to the only honest conclusion. The thing was exactly what it looked like. It was a machine, made of gears, made by the Greeks, to compute the motions of the heavens, and it had gone down with the ship 2,000 years ago, and it had waited on the seafloor all that, while for the storm and the sponge divers and the pale trembling man with his story of the dead. And here, I think, is the right place to stop and simply sit with the strangeness of it, before we go any further into the how and the why, because the strangeness is the whole heart of the matter, and it is worth feeling properly before we start to explain it away. We have grown so used, you and I, to the idea that history moves forward, that the past was simpler than the present, and the deep past simpler still, and that as you travel back in time, you travel back into a world of less and less knowledge, less skill, less machinery, until you reach the caves and the flint and the fire. It is a tidy picture, and mostly it is true. But the mechanism from Antikythera is a stone dropped into that tidy picture, and the ripples have never quite settled. Because here is a device of a complexity that, so far as we can tell from everything else that survives, simply should not have existed for another 1,400 years. It is not a little ahead of its time. It is enormously, almost unbelievably ahead of its time, a lonely peak of achievement standing up out of a landscape where we thought there were no such peaks at all. And then it vanished. That is the second half of the strangeness, and to me the sadder and the more haunting half. Whatever tradition of knowledge and craft produced this machine, it did not last. It did not spread and grow and become the foundation of an age of machines. It disappeared. The ship sank, and perhaps the workshop that made the machine closed, and the master died, and the apprentices scattered, and the particular marriage of astronomy and gearwork that this object represents was simply lost, so thoroughly lost that for well over a millennium no one on Earth could have built anything like it, and when at last the clockmakers of medieval Europe began, painfully, to work out how to make wheels turn other wheels to model the passage of time, they were not inheriting this knowledge. They were reinventing it, from scratch, having no idea that it had ever existed before. The Antikythera mechanism is a door that opened once, briefly, into a possible future that did not happen, and then closed, and the world went on for 14 centuries as though the door had never been there at all. I find that almost unbearably moving, if I am honest with you, in the way that the very old and the very lost can be moving late at night, when the day's noise has died down and there is room in the mind for larger and quieter feelings. Somewhere, in a Greek city in the last century before Christ, there were people who knew how to do this, who could take the wandering of the planets, that ancient and maddening puzzle that had occupied the finest minds of the Greek world for centuries, and capture it, tame it, gear it down into a box of bronze that a person could hold in 2 hands and turn with a little handle. And they are gone, and almost everything they knew is gone with them, and what is left is this one battered survivor, hauled up by accident from the bottom of the sea, a message in a bottle from a genius whose name we do not even know. So let us try, gently and in no hurry, to read that message. Let us do what the scholars have spent more than a century doing, which is to take this impossible object apart layer by layer and try to understand what it was and how it worked and who might have made it, and above all how it came to be sitting in the hold of a doomed ship in the first place. And we will do it slowly, because there is no rush, and because the pleasure of a thing like this is not in the answer but in the turning of it over and over in the mind, the way you might turn a smooth stone in your pocket, or the way the machine itself turns, wheel within wheel, one revolution setting off another. The whole quiet mechanism of thought moving towards sleep. Let me begin with what the divers actually recovered, and what happened to it. Because the object we talk about today is not a single clean thing but a handful of broken fragments, and understanding that is the first step to understanding everything else. When the lump split and the gearwork was recognised, the museum in Athens had on its hands not a machine, but the ruin of a machine. The largest surviving piece, the one usually called the main fragment, held the great 4-spoked wheel that drives much of the rest, and behind and around it a dense clutter of smaller wheels, all of it fused and corroded together into a single mass, some of it crushed almost flat. There were other, Smaller fragments too, broken away. Some found in that first campaign, and some, remarkably, only recognised decades later among the miscellaneous bits recovered from the wreck, quietly sitting in the museum's storerooms with no one realising what they were. Over the years the count of fragments grew, as pieces were sorted and matched and understood, until there were dozens of them, most quite small, ranging from that main mass down to little scraps the size of a coin, and together they represented perhaps a third of the original machine. Only a third. The rest, we must assume, either dissolved entirely into the sea over the 2,000 years, bronze being not eternal after all, or was lost in the sand of the wreck site, or was simply never recovered, still lying somewhere on that deep floor off the island, or crumbled to nothing in the handling of those early years, before anyone understood how fragile and how precious the pieces were. So everything, every single thing we think we know about the Antikythera mechanism has had to be reconstructed from perhaps a third of it, and much of that third crushed and corroded and jumbled. It is as though someone handed you a third of the pieces of a jigsaw puzzle, with no picture on the box, and no knowledge even of what the picture might be, and the pieces themselves warped and stained and broken, and asked you to tell them not only what the picture showed, but how the whole thing had been built and what it had been for. That is the task the scholars set themselves, and the astonishing thing, the thing that is a kind of quiet miracle of human patience and cleverness, is how far they have got. But it took a very long time, and for the first half-century after the discovery it hardly moved at all. The mechanism, once its basic nature was recognised, settled into a strange twilight of half-attention. Everyone agreed it was extraordinary. Almost no one knew what to do with it. The tools did not exist to see inside the fused fragments without destroying them, and the fragments were far too precious to risk. So it sat in its case in Athens, studied now and then by a scholar bold enough or curious enough to take it on, generating a paper here and a theory there, each one adding a little, each one running into the same wall, the wall of the corrosion, the wall of the third that was all that survived. You could see the gears on the surface. You could see that there were more gears behind them, sensed but not seen, hidden in the green mass. You could read a few of the inscriptions where they surfaced, teasing fragments of Greek text, words about the sun and the moon and the stars, words that promised meaning and would not quite give it up. It was like trying to read a book that had been left in the sea, most of its pages fused into a solid block, only the outermost lines of the outermost pages legible, and all the rest sealed inside, present but unreachable. For 50 years, that was where the matter rested, and I want to dwell here for a moment, on that long middle passage of neglect and half-attention, because there is something in it that speaks to the whole character of this story, and something oddly restful in it too. We tend to imagine discovery as a single bright moment, the flash of understanding, the shout in the laboratory. But the truth of a thing like this is that the moment of finding is only the very beginning, and what follows is decades, generations of slow and patient and often frustrated work, most of it done by people who never lived to see the puzzle solved, each one passing what they had learned to the next, like runners in a relay that lasts 100 years. The man who first recognised the gear wheel did not live to know what the machine truly did, nor did the next scholar, nor the next. They worked in the dark or in the dim half-light of what the tools of their time allowed, and they added their small increments of understanding, and they died, and others took up the work, and the machine sat patiently in its case and let itself be studied, revealing a little more each generation as the instruments of science slowly caught up with the impossibility of the thing. There is a lesson in that, I think, though I will not press it on you, about patience, and about the long collaborative labour of understanding, and about how the largest questions are answered not by single geniuses in single moments, but by chains of ordinary devoted people passing the work along across the years. But mostly I offer it to you as a shape to rest in. The machine waited 2,000 years on the seafloor. Then it waited another 50 in its museum case for the world to grow clever enough to read it. There is no hurry in this story anywhere. It is all patience, all the way down. The first real break came in the 1950s and 60s from an unlikely figure, a British scientist and historian named Derek de Solla Price, who became, in a sense, the machine's great modern champion, the man who first took it truly seriously as a piece of engineering and gave much of his life to understanding it. Price did something that seems obvious now but was a genuine leap then. He realized that if the fragments were full of gears you could not see, hidden inside the corroded mass, then the way to see them was not to cut the fragments open, which would destroy them, but to look through them, to use the rays that pass through solid matter and cast shadows of what lies within, to take, in other words, X-ray photographs of the mechanism and read the ghostly images of the buried gear wheels in the shadows on the film. When Price and his collaborators did this, the machine began, for the first time, to give up its inner secrets. The X-rays showed gears where the eye had seen only green corrosion. They allowed the teeth to be counted, actually counted tooth by tooth, in wheels that no living person had ever seen whole. And the counting of the teeth was the key to everything, because in a gear train the number of teeth on each wheel determines the ratios. The way the turning of one wheel translates into the faster or slower turning of the next, and the ratios are the mathematics, and the mathematics is the meaning. A wheel with more teeth turns its neighbour proportionally, and by working out the chain of these proportions, you can work out what the machine was calculating, what celestial cycle each pointer was tracking, how the input of the handle became the output of the sky. It is, when you understand it, breathtakingly elegant. The knowledge of astronomy was not stored in the machine as words or numbers written down. It was stored in the teeth of the gears, in the physical ratios of wheel to wheel, in the geometry of the thing itself. The machine did not describe the heavens. It embodied them. Turn the handle, and bronze wheels, meshing according to ratios chosen by a mind 2,000 years dead, would grind out the position of the moon tonight, or the date of the next eclipse, or the turning of a calendar cycle that took 19 years to complete, all of it emerging from the patient interlocking of toothed wheels, no writing required. The mathematics made solid and turnable in the hand. Price worked out a great deal from those first X-rays. He identified many of the gears and worked out some of the ratios, and understood that the machine was tracking the sun and the moon, and he published his findings, and for the first time the wider world began to grasp what had been pulled up off Antikythera. But the X-rays of his day were crude by our standards. Flat shadows in which the many layers of gears overlapped and confused one another, like trying to read a stack of transparent pages all at once, every line tangled with every other. He got the broad shape right and many of the details wrong, as pioneers do, and there was only so far the tools of his time could take him. And so once again the machine settled back to wait, understood now in outline but not in depth, its finest secrets still sealed in the corrosion, until the tools of a new century, tools Price never lived to use, could finish the reading he had begun. That new reading came in our own time, in the years around 2005 and after, when an international team of scientists and scholars brought to bear on the mechanism a set of instruments so far beyond anything Price had that it is a little like the difference between a candle and the sun. They used a machine, purpose-built and shipped to the museum in Athens, because the fragments were far too precious to travel, that could take X-rays not as flat shadows but in 3 dimensions, a technique that lets you reconstruct the entire interior of an object as a set of slices, and then move through those slices one at a time, seeing each buried layer of gears separately, unstacking the tangled pages at last, and reading each one clean. And they used another technique, a way of photographing the surface under light coming from many different angles, and then combining the images, that made the faint ghosts of the inscriptions leap out of the corroded bronze, as though freshly cut. Letters that had been unreadable for 2,000 years, suddenly sharp enough to transcribe. What these new eyes revealed was a machine even more sophisticated than Price had dared to think, more gears than he had counted. Inscriptions far more extensive than anyone had known survived, thousands of characters of tiny Greek text, a kind of instruction manual and description, engraved on the very surfaces of the device, telling the user what the pointers meant and what the machine could do. And a set of functions so ambitious, so complete, that the scholars who uncovered them found themselves, more than a century after the sponge divers, in exactly the same state as those first antiquaries, staring at the thing in a kind of stunned admiration and reaching for words large enough to hold what they were seeing. Let me tell you then, as best anyone now understands it, what this machine actually did, because this is the part where the wonder really opens out, and it is a lovely thing to let your mind move through slowly in the dark. On the front of the machine there was a great circular dial, and around it 2 scales, one marked with the 12 signs of the zodiac, the band of constellations through which the sun and moon and planets appear to move, and the other marked with the days of the year, the calendar. Across this front dial moved pointers. One pointer showed the position of the sun against the zodiac, where in the great circle of the sky the sun stood on any given day. Another showed the position of the moon, and the moon's pointer carried a small device, a little rotating ball painted half light and half dark, that turned to show the phase of the moon, the exact fraction of it lit up, waxing or waning, full or new, so that a person turning the handle could see not only where the moon was, but what shape it would show in the sky. And there is reason to think, from the surviving text and from the gaps in the gearwork where other wheels are lost, that there were pointers for the planets too, for the 5 wandering stars the ancients knew, Mercury and Venus and Mars and Jupiter and Saturn, each tracked around the same zodiac dial, each moving with its own peculiar and irregular pace. And here we come to one of the most beautiful subtleties of the whole design, so let me slow down and take real care with it, because it is worth it. The ancient Greeks knew, with painful precision, that the moon does not move across the sky at a steady speed. It hurries and it dawdles. Over the course of its monthly circuit it runs faster at some times and slower at others, because its orbit is not a perfect circle, but an ellipse, though the Greeks did not think of it that way, and it comes nearer to us and then swings further off, and its apparent speed against the stars changes accordingly. This is a real thing, a genuine irregularity in the moon's motion, and any machine that claimed to model the moon and simply turned its pointer at a constant rate would be wrong, visibly wrong, wrong to anyone who watched the real moon in the real sky. And the makers of the Antikythera mechanism knew this, and they did not cheat, and this is where you should really let your jaw come loose with wonder. They built into the machine a way of making the moon pointer speed up and slow down, faster and slower, in just the pattern the real moon follows. They did it with a small and cunning arrangement of 2 gears, one mounted slightly off-centre from the other, with a little pin on one riding in a slot on the other, so that as the pair turned together, the off-centre pin drove the second gear now a little faster, now a little slower, in a smoothly varying rhythm. It is a device that engineers would recognise today, a way of turning steady rotation into varying rotation, and the Greeks who built this machine invented it, or knew it, and used it to make a bronze moon that hurried and dawdled exactly as the true moon hurries and dawdles in the night sky. I want you to sit with that for a moment, in the dark, because it is one of those facts that grows larger the longer you look at it. Somebody, 2,000 years ago, cared enough about getting the moon right, understood the moon's motion well enough, and commanded the craft of gears well enough to build a mechanical correction for the subtle unevenness of the moon into a box of bronze the size of a book. That is not the work of a tinkerer. That is the work of a tradition, a deep and confident tradition, of people who had thought long and hard about the heavens and about how to capture them in metal. And it is exactly that tradition, so evidently rich and so evidently mature, that makes its disappearance so bewildering. You do not get a device like this out of nowhere. There must have been simpler ones before it, and drawings, and failures, and a slow accumulation of skill across generations. Where are they? Where is the rest of the tradition that this one survivor implies? Gone, melted down, rotted away, lost at sea, dropped out of history so completely that this single object stands almost alone, the visible tip of a vanished mountain of knowledge and craft, and everything below the waterline of that mountain is simply dark. But I am getting ahead of myself and running toward the sadness before we have finished with the wonder, and the wonder is not done. If you are finding, as I hope you are, that there is comfort in these slow ancient mysteries, in following a question by lamplight without any hurry toward the answer, then do stay with us, subscribe and settle in with us here by the lamp, because there is a new one waiting for you every week, another old and gentle puzzle to keep you company as you drift. And now back to the machine, and to the half of it we have not yet seen. Because the front of the machine, the sun and the moon and the planets and the calendar, is only half of it. Turn the machine over in your mind and look at the back. Because the back is where the design climbs to its full height, and where the makers were doing something even more remarkable than modelling the moon. On the back of the mechanism there were two large dials, and they were not simple circles but spirals, grooved spirals of several turns, with a little pointer that followed the spiral round and round, moving outward turn by turn, and a small sliding marker that a person would move by hand to keep their place as the pointer worked its way through the coils. And these spiral dials tracked the great cycles of time, the long rhythms by which the sun and moon and calendar all come back into agreement, the cycles that the ancient astronomers had discovered by centuries of patient watching and record-keeping. Let me try to give you a feeling for what those cycles are, because they are beautiful in themselves and they lie at the very root of why anyone would build such a machine at all. The trouble with timekeeping, the trouble that has vexed every civilization that ever tried to make a calendar, is that the sun and the moon do not agree. The day is set by the sun. The month, in its origin, is set by the moon, from one new moon to the next. And the year is set by the sun again, by the turning of the seasons, the sun's slow climb and fall through the year, and these do not divide evenly into one another. The moon's month is not a neat fraction of the sun's year. 12 lunar months fall short of a solar year by some days, 13 overshoot. So any calendar that tries to honour both the moon and the sun, as most ancient calendars did, drifts and must be patched, a month inserted here, a day there, a perpetual and irritating bookkeeping to keep the festivals in their proper seasons, and the whole thing from sliding out of true. And the ancient astronomers, the Babylonians first, and then the Greeks who learned from them, discovered something wonderful buried in this mess, which is that although the sun and moon do not agree in the short run, they do come back into agreement over longer cycles, if you are patient enough to find them. There is a cycle of 19 years, for instance, after which the phases of the moon fall again on the same days of the solar year, so that the whole pattern of full moons and new moons repeats. 19 years, and the moon comes home to where it started against the calendar. And there are longer cycles still, cycles of cycles, and cycles governing when eclipses will occur, for eclipses too follow a rhythm, a stately repeating pattern that the Babylonians had worked out from centuries of records, a cycle of about 18 years after which the pattern of eclipses very nearly repeats itself, so that if you know when the eclipses fell in one such period you can predict, with fair accuracy, when they will fall in the next. And the Antikythera mechanism modelled these cycles, all of them, on its spiral back dials. One spiral tracked the 19-year cycle that reconciles the moon and the calendar. Another tracked the great eclipse cycle, and here is a detail that I find almost tender in its thoughtfulness. Around the eclipse spiral, at the points where eclipses were predicted to fall, there were little inscriptions, glyphs, marking not only that an eclipse would occur, but details about it. Whether it would be a solar or a lunar eclipse, roughly what hour it might be expected, even in some cases a note about the colour the moon might take, for the ancients watched the reddening of the eclipsed moon and thought it meaningful. So the machine did not merely say an eclipse is coming, it said an eclipse of the moon is coming, on this day, around this hour, and it may be red. Turn the handle, watch the pointer creep along the spiral, and read the sky's future written in bronze. And there was more even than this, layered into the same back dials, because the Greeks were nothing if not thorough. There was a smaller dial that tracked a 4-year cycle, and this one, when the inscriptions on it were finally read with the new instruments in our own century, gave up a detail so charming and so human that it made headlines around the world. The 4-year dial was marked with the names of games. Athletic festivals. The great recurring competitions of the Greek world held on their fixed cycles, and chief among them the Olympic Games, the games at Olympia, from which we take our modern Olympics, held every 4 years just as ours are. The machine tracked the Olympics. Amid all its grand modelling of the sun and moon and the eclipses and the deep cycles of time, someone had thought it worthwhile to include a little dial that would tell you which of the great games fell in which year, so that a person turning the handle could know not only when the moon would be eclipsed, but when the athletes would gather at Olympia, and at the other festival sites whose names are also engraved there. It is such a human touch, such a lovely descent from the cosmic to the civic, the eternal cycles of the heavens, and, right there beside them, the 4-year rhythm of the foot races and the wrestling. It reminds you that this machine was not made by abstractions but by people. People who lived in a world of festivals and games and the ordinary marking of the years, and who wanted their model of time to include the times that mattered to them, the human times as well as the celestial ones. I love that little dial more than almost anything else about the machine, and I offer it to you as a kind of gift to hold as you drift. The image of a bronze wheel 2,000 years old, turning slowly, keeping track of the Olympic Games. So now you have some picture, I hope, of the sheer reach of the thing. On the front, the sun and moon and planets moving through the zodiac. The moon showing its phase in a little turning ball, the moon even speeding and slowing to match the real moon's uneven pace. On the back, the great spirals of the calendar cycles and the eclipse cycles, with eclipses foretold to the hour and almost to the colour, and the little civic dial of the games. All of it driven by a single handle on the side, all of it geared together, dozens of bronze wheels meshing in a space no bigger than a thick book. The whole knowledge of Greek astronomy folded up and made turnable in the hand. And all of it, every scrap of what I have just described, reconstructed by patient scholars from a third of the original, most of that third crushed and corroded, read out of shadows in X-rays and ghosts of letters coaxed from green bronze. When you set the two halves of the story side by side, the ancient achievement and the modern reconstruction of it, they begin to rhyme. Both of them monuments of patience, both of them triumphs of the human refusal to leave a puzzle unturned. And now, having seen what the machine did, we can begin to ask the harder and the deeper questions. The ones that no X-ray can answer. The ones that keep the mechanism a mystery even now that we understand its gears. Who made it? How did they come to know what they knew? Why does nothing else like it survive? And how, of all the strange turns in this strange story, did it end up in the hold of a ship on the bottom of the sea? Let us take those slowly, one at a time, through the deeper part of the night, and let us not be in any hurry to answer them, because the questions are more restful than the answers, and some of them have no answers at all, only the long, pleasant ache of wondering. Start with the ship, because the ship is the most concrete of the mysteries and the easiest to feel our way into. We know, from the coins and the pottery and the style of the objects, roughly when the ship went down, in the 1st century before Christ, in the decades either side of the year 60 or so before Christ, give or take. We know, from the cargo, roughly what the ship was doing. It was carrying art, Greek art, statues and fine bronzes and luxury goods, from the eastern Mediterranean, from the old wealthy Greek cities of the Aegean, and the coast of what is now Turkey, westward, toward Rome, toward Italy, toward the market of the new masters of the world, because this was the age when Rome had conquered the Greek East, and Roman generals and Roman senators and wealthy Roman families had developed an enormous appetite for Greek art. An appetite that emptied the temples and the public squares of the Greek cities of their statues and shipped them west by the boatload to decorate the villas of the conquerors. Some of it was bought, some of it was plundered, some of it was tribute. The flow was the same, a great river of the accumulated art of centuries moving westward across the sea. And our ship was part of that river, a heavy freighter loaded with treasures, and somewhere off the wild strait by Antikythera, In a storm perhaps not unlike the one that centuries later drove the sponge divers to shelter there, it foundered and went down with everything aboard, the statues and the glassware and the coins, and tucked away somewhere in the hold or in a chest or in a passenger's baggage, the machine. Now here is a question to lie awake over pleasantly. Whose was it? Was the machine part of the cargo, another luxury object being shipped west to be sold, an astronomical wonder destined for the study of some rich Roman who would keep it as a marvel and a conversation piece? Or did it belong to someone on the ship, a passenger, a scholar, an astronomer travelling west with his precious instrument in his baggage, a man who went down with the ship and his machine together and lies somewhere still in the deep sand off the island? We cannot know. But the question opens a little window onto the world of the thing, and I like to stand at that window and look through. Imagine the machine when it was new, not green and corroded and crushed, as we have it, but bright, the bronze, the warm gold of fresh metal, the dials crisp, the pointers sharp, the little moon ball freshly painted half silver and half black, the whole thing housed, we think, in a wooden case with doors that opened to reveal the dials, the case itself carrying more inscriptions, more of that engraved manual telling the user what everything meant. Imagine it sitting on a table in a study in some Greek city, in the lamplight, and imagine the person who owned it turning the handle slowly, watching the sun creep along the zodiac, watching the moon swell and shrink in its little window, watching the pointer feel its way along the eclipse spiral toward the next darkening of the moon. Imagine the pride of ownership, the wonder of the guests to whom it was shown, the sheer intellectual delight of holding the heavens in a box and turning them with your hand. That machine was somebody's treasure. Somebody loved it, or coveted it, or was proud of it. And then it went into the sea, and the person who loved it, whoever they were, is as lost as the machine's own name. There is a particular sadness in a treasured object outliving all knowledge of who treasured it, and the mechanism is that sadness made solid, a beloved thing whose lover is forgotten. But let us leave the ship and go further back and deeper in, to the harder question of who made the machine and where. On this the scholars have argued long and hard, and the honest answer is that we do not certainly know, but there are clues, and the clues point in some fascinating directions, and following them is a lovely slow walk through the intellectual geography of the ancient Greek world. The first clue is the inscriptions, the thousands of characters of tiny Greek text engraved on the machine, because language and the style of letters and the particular words used can all be studied, and they place the machine firmly in the Greek scientific tradition and give hints about where in the Greek world it might have been made. The second clue is the astronomy itself, the specific cycles the machine models, because some of these cycles are associated with particular astronomers and particular schools, and the machine's choices about what to include and how to calculate it can be matched tentatively against what we know of the different centres of Greek astronomical learning. And the third clue, the most tantalising, is the little dial of the games, because the particular festivals it names and the particular way it names them may point toward a particular region, a particular corner of the Greek world where those games mattered most, and where therefore the machine may have been made or made for. Following these clues, different scholars have pointed to different places and different possible makers. Some have looked toward the island of Rhodes, a great centre of astronomy and learning in that age, home to famous astronomers, a place where the knowledge the machine embodies was demonstrably present, and a plausible place for such a device to have been built. Others have looked toward the Greek cities of Sicily and the western Mediterranean, drawn by that little dial of the games and by an ancient tradition, recorded by Roman writers, that connects the greatest scientific mind of the age, Archimedes, with the making of just such astronomical devices. And this brings us to a thread in the story that is almost too good to be true, and that I want to handle carefully, because it is easy to overstate and the truth is more interesting than the legend. The Roman writers, Cicero chief among them, tell us that Archimedes, the supreme genius of Greek mathematics and engineering, who lived in the Greek city of Syracuse in Sicily a bit more than a century before our ship sank, built devices that modelled the heavens. Cicero describes a sphere, a mechanical model of the cosmos, made by Archimedes, that showed the motions of the sun and moon and planets, and he writes of it with wonder, as a marvel that captured the movements of the heavens in a single turning device. This is not the Antikythera mechanism itself. Archimedes was long dead before our machine was made. But it tells us that the idea, the tradition of building geared or otherwise mechanical models of the heavens, went back at least to Archimedes, back a century and more before our surviving machine, and it tells us that the greatest minds of the Greek world had turned their attention to exactly this problem, the capturing of the cosmos in a mechanism, and had, apparently, succeeded. So the Antikythera mechanism is not, after all, quite a bolt from the blue. It is the one survivor of a tradition that the texts tell us existed, a tradition of astronomical machines reaching back to Archimedes and perhaps beyond, a tradition of which every other physical example has been lost and which survives, in the flesh, in this single battered object from the sea. That does not make it less wonderful. If anything, it makes it more, because it means the machine is not a freak, not a one-off accident of genius, but the representative of a whole lost world of Greek mechanical astronomy, a world we would know almost nothing about were it not for this one thing that happened to go down with a ship and happened to be found. And it sharpens the sadness of the disappearance too, because it means what was lost was not a single machine, but an entire tradition, a whole line of knowledge and craft, of which this is the last and only witness. Let me linger a little longer on the detective work of place, because it is one of the most satisfying threads to follow. The way the scholars have tried to pin down where in the wide Greek world this machine was born, and the clues they have used are so small and so clever that following them is a real pleasure. Take the calendar, the names of the months. The Greek world was not a single country, but a scatter of cities and regions, and each region had its own calendar, its own names for the months, its own local way of ordering the year, the way the old counties and provinces of any country keep their own customs. And the Antikythera mechanism carries, engraved on it, the names of the months of its calendar, and when the scholars read those names, freshly legible under the new imaging, they found that they matched the calendar of a particular corner of the Greek world, a family of calendars used in certain northwestern regions and in some of the Greek colonies of the west. That single clue, the names of the months, narrows the machine's likely origin considerably, points away from some regions and toward others, and it is a marvellous thing, when you think about it, that a machine can tell you where it came from by the names it uses for its months. The way a person's accent or turn of phrase can place their home. Then take the games on that little 4-year dial, and here the clue sharpens further, because among the festivals named there is one that was a rather local affair, a games held in a particular region, not one of the great pan-Greek festivals that everyone everywhere would track, but a more regional competition whose inclusion suggests the machine was made by or for someone to whom that particular regional festival mattered, someone from that corner of the Greek world, and this points in the same direction as the calendar, toward the northwest of Greece and its western colonial connections. And then there is the deeper astronomical detective work, the attempt to match the specific way the machine calculates its cycles, the particular numbers built into its gears, against the known work of particular astronomers and schools, for the Greek world had several great centres of astronomical learning, and they did not all calculate everything the same way, and the choices the machine's makers made, the specific cycles they used and the specific values they built into the teeth, can be compared against what we know of those different schools. Some of these comparisons point toward the tradition associated with the great astronomers of Rhodes, that famous island centre of learning, and there is a real and serious case, argued by serious scholars, that the machine was made on Rhodes or in a workshop steeped in the Rhodian astronomical tradition, even if the calendar and the games point their fingers a little further west. And you should not be troubled that the clues do not all point to exactly the same spot, because a machine like this could easily have been made in one place by makers trained in the tradition of another. It could have been designed by an astronomer of one school and calibrated to the calendar of the region where it would be used and sold, the way a fine instrument today might be designed in one country, built in another, and calibrated for a customer in a third. The clues pointing in slightly different directions may simply be telling us the different threads that came together in the making. The astronomy from here, the calendar from there, the games from the customer's home region, all woven into the one object. And I find that a richer and more human picture than a single tidy answer would be. The picture of a machine that is itself a little crossroads of the Greek world, carrying in its engravings the astronomy of one place and the calendar of another and the festivals of a third, a small bronze meeting point of the scattered learning of a whole civilization. We may never know the exact workshop, the exact city, the exact hand, but we know a great deal about the world that hand worked in, and the machine, read carefully, tells us more about that world than almost any text could, and there is a deep pleasure in that slow, careful reading, in the way patience and cleverness together can coax a lost machine into naming, if not its maker. Then at least the shape of the world its maker lived in. Let me stay with that sadness for a while, because it is the deep note of the whole story, and it is worth sounding properly, here in the middle of the night when deep notes belong. Why did it vanish? Why, having built machines like this, having reached this astonishing peak, did the ancient world not go on from it, build more, build better, hand the knowledge down until the age of machines arrived 1,000 and more years early? This is one of the great sad questions of history, and it has no certain answer, but there are things we can say, and they are worth turning over slowly. Part of the answer is simply that ancient knowledge was fragile in a way we can hardly imagine, living as we do in an age when everything is copied 1 billion times and stored in 1,000 places. In the ancient world, knowledge lived in a very few copies, in scrolls that rotted and burned, and in the heads and hands of a very few skilled people, who taught a very few apprentices, who might or might not carry the knowledge on. A tradition like the one that made the Antikythera mechanism might have rested, at any given moment, on a mere handful of workshops, a few master craftsmen, a small number of scrolls describing the astronomy and perhaps the mechanics. And such a thing is terribly easy to lose. A workshop closes. A master dies before he has fully trained his successor. A city is sacked. A library burns. A war disrupts the patient chains of teaching on which everything depends. The knowledge does not have to be forgotten by everyone at once. It only has to fail to be passed on, once, in the wrong place, at the wrong time, and it is gone. And there is no backup, no other copy, no way to recover it. The astonishing thing about ancient knowledge is not that so much was lost, but that anything survived at all, given how thin the threads were on which it all hung. And part of the answer, too, is the great disruption that overtook the ancient world in the centuries after our ship sank. The long, slow unravelling that we call, too simply, the fall of Rome. The Mediterranean world that had produced this machine did not end suddenly, but over centuries it was transformed, its cities shrinking, its trade routes fraying, its accumulated learning scattered and, in many places, forgotten. Much of the science of the Greeks was lost to the Western world for centuries, preserved where it was preserved at all, in the East, in the libraries of Byzantium, and later in the great translation movements of the Islamic world, which saved and studied and built upon a great deal of Greek astronomy and mathematics. But the specific tradition of the geared astronomical machine seems to have thinned to almost nothing, a technique too specialized, too dependent on rare craft, to survive the general shrinking of the world. There are hints that something of it lingered, that the idea of the geared calendar device passed east and was known in a simpler form in the medieval Islamic world, and that from there perhaps some seed of it eventually reached medieval Europe and helped, in some indirect way, to inspire the first mechanical clocks. But the direct line, the living tradition that could build a machine as subtle as the Antikythera mechanism, was broken, and once broken it could not be mended, and the world had to reinvent, slowly and from the beginning, the art of making wheels turn wheels to model the passage of time. And I want to dwell for a moment on that reinvention, because it is the far side of the story. the eventual return of the geared machine after its long absence, and it puts the mechanism's loneliness into a kind of relief that I find quietly moving. 1400 years, give or take, after our ship went down, in the towns and monasteries and cathedral cities of medieval Europe, people began to build the first mechanical clocks. Great iron mechanisms driven by falling weights, regulated by clever escapements, made to ring the hours and, in the grandest cases, to model the heavens, for many of the finest early clocks were also astronomical. Fitted with dials that showed the phase of the moon and the position of the sun and the wandering of the planets, some of them astonishingly elaborate, whole cathedral fronts given over to turning golden suns and moons and processions of figures. And here is the thing that catches at me. The people who built those medieval astronomical clocks had, so far as we can tell, no idea that anything like the Antikythera mechanism had ever existed. They were not recovering a lost art. They were inventing it, again from the beginning, driven by the same impulse that had driven the ancient makers. The desire to capture the turning heavens in a made thing of metal, arriving by their own long road at the same destination the Greeks had reached and lost more than 1,000 years before. Two separate times, then, in the whole history of the human race, people climbed to this particular peak, the geared model of the cosmos, and the first time they climbed it, the summit was lost again and the very memory of the climb erased, and the second time they had to start from the valley floor with no knowledge that anyone had ever stood up there before. There is something almost unbearably poignant in that, and also something oddly reassuring, and I have been turning over, lying here in the dark, which of the two feelings is the truer response. The poignancy is obvious, the waste of it, the thought of all that the world might have been had the ancient tradition not been lost, had the climb not had to be made twice. But the reassurance is real too, and perhaps deeper, and it is this. The impulse came back. The knowledge was lost, but the hunger that had produced the knowledge was not lost, because it was not a possession that could be melted down or drowned or forgotten. It was something in the grain of the human mind itself, the need to understand the heavens and to hold them, the love of the hard, beautiful problem, and that need, that love, survived the fall of Rome and the long dark centuries, and welled up again, unprompted, in the mind of medieval Europe, and drove people back up the same mountain. So the mechanism's loss was not, in the very longest view, a permanent defeat, because the thing that mattered most, the impulse behind it, could not be lost. Only the particular fruits of the impulse, which grew again in their own time. And I find, when I hold it that way, that the sadness softens into something gentler, into a kind of faith, not in the permanence of any particular knowledge which the mechanism warns us against, but in the permanence of the hunger for knowledge which the mechanism in its own way also demonstrates, by being the first fruit of a hunger that came back. We are, all of us, the children of that hunger, the same hunger that made the machine and lost it, and made the cathedral clocks, and in the end made the instruments that finally read the machine's secrets out of the sea, corroded bronze. The hunger is the through line, the unbroken thread, running under all the breaks and losses, and it is running still, tonight, in laboratories and observatories, and in the mind of anyone who has ever looked up at the night sky and wanted to understand it. And you are one of them, lying here in the dark, letting an old story carry you towards sleep, an inheritor of the same long, patient love of the heavens that a Greek maker poured into bronze 2,000 years ago. That is not a small thing to be. It is, I think, one of the finest things to be, and a good thing to know about yourself as you drift off, that you belong to the long line of the watchers and the wanderers, and that the machine, in its case in Athens, is in some sense a family heirloom, a thing made by your own distant kin, kept for you across the centuries by the accidents of the sea. And so we come back to the image I gave you earlier, the door that opened once and closed, and I think we can feel its full weight now. Here was a people who could do this, who had, by centuries of patient watching of the sky and centuries of accumulating mathematical insight and generations of refining the craft of gears, arrived at the ability to build a working mechanical model of the cosmos, accurate, subtle, correcting even for the fine irregularities of the moon's motion, tracking the eclipses years in advance, keeping the calendar and the cycles and even the games, and the ability did not last. It was not built upon. It was lost so completely that its very existence was doubted when the evidence for it came up out of the sea, so completely that for 2,000 years the world had no idea it had ever been possible. And I think the reason this moves us so, the reason it is not merely an interesting historical fact, but something that catches at the heart in the small hours, is that it is a mirror. It shows us how fragile our own knowing is. We tend to assume that what we know is safe, that progress is permanent, that having climbed to some height of understanding we will never fall back from it, and the Antikythera mechanism, quietly, from the bottom of the sea, tells us otherwise. It tells us that a civilization can reach a peak and then lose it. That knowledge can simply vanish, not because it is disproved, but because the threads that carried it are cut. That there is no law of history guaranteeing that what is known will stay known. It is a humbling thing to hold, and a strangely calming one too, in the way that large true things are calming, the way the sea is calming even though it drowns ships, the way the night sky is calming even though it is mostly emptiness and cold. The machine puts our own moment in its place, makes it one moment among many, neither the first to know things, nor guaranteed to be the last. And there is a comfort in that, I find, a loosening of the grip we keep on our own importance, a permission to be small and brief and part of something very long. But let me pull us back from the deep water for a while, because I do not want to leave you only with the sadness, and because there is so much more in this machine that is pure delight, pure human ingenuity. That deserves its turn in the lamplight. Let us go back inside the mechanism itself, and look more closely at how it actually worked, at the cleverness of its construction, because the more you understand of the how, the more astonishing the whole thing becomes. And there is a deep restfulness in following the logic of a well-made machine, the way each part answers to the next. The way the whole thing hangs together with an inevitability that is almost like music. The heart of the machine, the thing everything else depends on, is the great four-spoked gear, the largest wheel in the whole assembly, mounted at the front. When you turn the handle on the side of the box, you are, through a small gear, turning this great wheel, and this great wheel is the sun. That is to say, one full turn of this great wheel represents 1 year, the sun's complete circuit through the zodiac, and everything else in the machine is geared off this master wheel, driven by it, calculated from it. So the fundamental act of using the machine is to turn the handle and thereby drive the year forward or backward, and as the year turns, everything else turns with it, in its proper proportion, the moon racing round 12 or 13 times for every 1 turn of the sun, the eclipse pointer creeping slowly along its spiral, the planets, if they were there and we think they were, moving in their strange irregular dance, all of it flowing from that one master wheel, that one bronze sun turned by a human hand. And the way the makers got the different speeds, the different celestial cycles, out of that single input is the real genius of the thing, and it is worth understanding because it is genuinely beautiful. It is all in the teeth. If you have a wheel with, say, 64 teeth, driving a wheel with 32 teeth, then the smaller wheel turns twice for every once the larger turns, because it has half as many teeth to be pushed past the same number of the larger wheel's teeth. Change the numbers and you change the ratio, and by choosing the numbers of teeth on each wheel carefully, and by chaining wheel after wheel together, each pair contributing its own ratio, you can build up almost any overall relationship you like between the turning of the handle and the turning of a given pointer. So the makers, wanting the moon pointer to complete a certain number of circuits for each circuit of the sun, in exactly the proportion that the real moon bears to the real year, worked out a chain of gears whose combined ratio would produce that proportion, and cut the teeth accordingly, tooth by tooth, by hand, in thin bronze. And wanting the eclipse pointer to creep round its spiral in the long slow rhythm of the eclipse cycle, they worked out another chain, with another combined ratio matched to that cycle, and wanting the 19-year calendar cycle, another chain again. Every function of the machine is a ratio, and every ratio is a chain of gears, and every gear is a specific and deliberate number of teeth, chosen so that the mathematics of the heavens would emerge correct from the turning of the wheels. When you truly grasp this, when you feel the way the astronomical knowledge is not written on the machine but built into it, embodied in the very counts of the teeth, you understand that the makers were doing something we would now call, without exaggeration, computing. They were building a physical calculator, a device that performs calculations not with numbers written down, but with the turning of geared wheels, the mathematics made mechanical, the answer emerging not on a page, but at the tip of a moving pointer. And they were doing it 2,000 years ago, with hand tools, in bronze, and they were doing it well enough that the answers came out right. There is one refinement in all this that deserves its own moment, and it is the one I mentioned before, the correction for the moon's uneven motion, because it is the single cleverest piece of engineering in the whole machine, and it repays a closer look. To make the moon pointer speed up and slow down in the right rhythm, the makers used a pair of gears mounted on a shared wheel, one gear pinned slightly off-centre from the other, with a pin on one riding in a slot cut into the other. As the shared wheel carried the pair around, the off-centre mounting meant that the driving gear and the driven gear were sometimes closer to being aligned and sometimes further off, and this changing relationship through the pin and the slot made the driven gear turn now faster, now slower, in a smooth cycle, exactly the varying speed the moon shows. It is a device for converting steady motion into varying motion, and it is elegant almost beyond belief for its age. And when the scholars of our own century finally understood it, teasing it out of the X-ray slices, there was a real sense of awe, because it showed that the makers had not merely known that the moon's motion was uneven, but had understood a way to reproduce that unevenness, mechanically, which is a far deeper and harder thing. And it points once again to the depth of the tradition behind the machine, because a trick like that is not something you invent for a single object. It is something that is developed, refined, passed down, part of a body of mechanical knowledge that must have existed and must have been considerable, and that is, but for this one survivor, entirely lost to us. Every time you look closely at the machine, this same thing happens. You find a piece of cleverness so mature, so assured, that it forces you to imagine a whole hinterland of knowledge behind it, a whole world of makers and thinkers and their accumulated craft, and then you remember that the hinterland is gone, that this one object is nearly all we have of it. And the wonder and the loss twist together again into that particular ache that the mechanism, more than almost any object I know, produces in the person who contemplates it long enough. Let me tell you now about the inscriptions, because I have mentioned them several times and they deserve their own proper telling, and because they are, in their way, as moving as the gears, all over the surviving surfaces of the machine, and on the plates that once covered it, there are engraved letters, tiny Greek characters, thousands of them, so small in places that they can only be read with the aid of the machines that image the surface under many angles of light. And these inscriptions are not decoration. They are text. They are, in effect, the manual and the description of the machine, telling the user what the pointers show, what the dials mean, what cycles are being tracked, and, in places, giving astronomical information. The kind of thing you would want written down beside such a device to make sense of it. There are descriptions of the planets and their motions. There are the details around the eclipse predictions, the notes about which eclipses would be solar and which lunar, and at what hour, and even, as I said, the colour. There are the names of the months, in a particular regional form of the Greek calendar that itself became a clue to where the machine might have been made. There are the names of the games on the little 4-year dial. Reading these inscriptions letter by painful letter out of the corroded bronze has been one of the great labours of the modern study of the mechanism, and it has transformed our understanding, turning the machine from a mute assemblage of gears into something that, in a sense, speaks, that tells us in its own ancient words what it was for. And there is something profoundly touching in that, in the fact that the makers wrote on their machine explained it, labelled it, as though anticipating that someone, someday, would need to be told what it did. They could not have imagined that the someone would be us, 2,000 years later, reading their tiny letters with instruments they could never have dreamed of, out of a fragment hauled from the bottom of the sea. But they wrote, all the same, carefully, in that minute-engraved hand, and their writing has survived, most of it, sealed in the corrosion that both destroyed and preserved the machine, and it has come down to us across all that time and all that water, and we can read it, and it tells us about the moon and the sun and the games at Olympia. There are few things in all of archaeology, I think, that so directly join a living mind to an ancient one across so great a gulf as the reading of those small green letters. Let me tell you now where the knowledge in those letters came from, because the astronomy embodied in the machine did not spring up overnight in the mind of a single clever Greek, and the long road by which it arrived is one of the gentlest and most patient stories in the whole history of the human mind, and it makes fine company for a drifting hour. Go back then, further even than the Greeks, to the flat land between the two great rivers, to the country the ancients called the land between the rivers, where the oldest cities of the world stood, and where, for many centuries before any Greek looked seriously at the sky, the priests and scribes of those cities had been watching the heavens night after night, and, crucially, writing down what they saw. This is the thing that the peoples of that ancient land gave to the world, more precious in the long run than any of their walls or their kings, the habit of the record. They kept, on tablets of clay, night after night, year after year, generation after generation, careful notes of where the moon was, and where the planets were, and when the eclipses came, and how bright the stars shone, an unbroken chain of observation stretching back across centuries. The longest continuous scientific record the ancient world ever produced. And out of that great heap of patient watching, out of centuries of clay tablets stacked in temple archives, the astronomers of that land began to find the patterns, the cycles, the deep repeating rhythms that only reveal themselves to those who watch long enough and write it all down. They found the eclipse cycle, the long rhythm of about 18 years after which the eclipses very nearly repeat, and they found it not by any theory but simply by looking at their own records and noticing that the pattern came round again. And they could predict eclipses, roughly, from that alone, from the sheer weight of accumulated observation. They worked out the varying speed of the moon, its hurrying and dawdling, and they described it in tables of numbers, month by month, the moon a little faster here and a little slower there, all of it derived from watching and recording and finding the pattern in the record. This was the great inheritance, and when the Greek world came into contact with it, in the centuries after the conquests that spread Greek culture eastward across those ancient lands, the Greeks took this treasure of accumulated observation and did with it the thing the Greeks did best. They asked why. The watchers of the ancient riverland had described what the heavens did, with wonderful accuracy, but had been largely content to describe it, to catch the patterns in tables and use them to predict. The Greeks wanted more. They wanted to know the shape of the thing behind the patterns, the geometry of it, the model, the machinery, if you like, of the cosmos itself, and they set about building, in their minds and on their diagrams, geometrical schemes that would explain and reproduce the motions the Eastern watchers had recorded. And so the astronomy that the Antikythera mechanism embodies is really two great traditions married together, the patient centuries of Eastern observation and the Greek genius for geometry and model making, and you can see both of them in the machine. The eclipse cycle and the moon's varying speed coming out of the Eastern records, and the whole idea of building a working geometrical model of the heavens coming out of the Greek mind. The machine is, in a sense, the offspring of that marriage, the point where the record and the reason meet and are made turnable in bronze, and when you understand that, you understand that the machine is not the achievement of a single generation or a single people, but the distilled result of many centuries of human attention to the sky, poured, at last, into a box you could hold in your hands. I find that a beautiful thing to rest in, the thought of all those anonymous watchers on all those ancient roofs. The priests of the river land marking their tablets by starlight, the Greek geometers bent over their diagrams, none of them knowing that their patient work would one day be gathered up and geared together and sent west on a ship and lost in the sea and found again by sponge divers. None of them knowing that we, tonight, would be the inheritors of their watching. Every time the moon pointer on that machine sped up or slowed down, it was reciting, in bronze, a lesson that had taken the human race the better part of 1,000 years of nightly attention to learn. Now let me take you on a slow walk down the row of fragments themselves, because I have spoken of them in the mass. The third that survives, the crushed and corroded pieces. But each of the main fragments has its own character and its own contribution, and to visit them one by one is a quiet pleasure, like walking down a gallery of related paintings and pausing at each. There is, first, the great fragment, the largest, the one that holds the heart of the machine, the big 4-spoked drive wheel and much of the gearing packed behind it. And it is this fragment that has given up the most, that was studied first, that showed Price's gears and gave the modern team the richest harvest of hidden wheels when they turned their 3-dimensional X-rays upon it. To look at it is to look at a green and broken slab, unpromising, and to know that inside it, layered and stacked, is the densest concentration of ancient engineering that survives anywhere in the world. Then there are the fragments that carry the back dials, the pieces on which the spirals are preserved, and it is from these that the scholars read the calendar cycle and the eclipse cycle, and, on one small piece, that astonishing little dial of the games, the reading of which was one of the great moments of the modern study, when the name of a festival came clear out of the corrosion under the new imaging and a whole new dimension of the machine's purpose opened up. There are fragments that are mostly inscription, plates that once covered or backed the mechanism, dense with the tiny engraved text, and these are in some ways the most eloquent of all, because they are the machine's own words, the manual it carried on its skin. And there are the small fragments, the scraps and slivers, some no bigger than a fingernail, each one carrying perhaps a single partial gear or a few letters or a fragment of a scale, and each one a puzzle in itself, a matter of years of study to place, to understand where in the whole assembly it once belonged. The work of fitting these fragments into a coherent picture of the whole machine is one of the great intellectual jigsaw puzzles of our time, and it has been carried on by scholars from many countries, astronomers and historians and specialists in ancient technology, and experts in the imaging of corroded metal, working together, arguing, publishing, revising, across decades. I want to say a little about them, the modern investigators, because they are as much a part of this story as the ancient makers, and their patience and devotion is a kind of echo of the patience and devotion that made the machine in the first place. Picture a team gathered in the museum in Athens, in the early years of our own century, with their great imaging machine, a device the size of a small van, hauled into the museum at considerable trouble and expense, because the fragments were far too precious to be allowed to travel to it. Picture them, over days and weeks, carefully positioning each fragment, taking their X-rays from every angle, building up, slice by slice, a complete 3-dimensional map of the interior of each piece, every buried gear, every tooth, every axle rendered visible at last in the reconstructed image. And then picture the long months and years afterward, back in their universities, poring over those images, counting teeth, tracing gear trains, working out ratios, matching the ratios to the astronomical cycles, arguing about what connected to what, slowly assembling, out of all that data, a working understanding of a machine that no one had seen whole for 2,000 years. It was, in its way, as difficult and as beautiful a piece of work as the making of the machine itself, and it required the same qualities: patience, precision, the refusal to give up in the face of a problem that seemed at first impossibly hard, and the joy of it when the pieces fell into place, when a gear train was finally understood and a function of the machine came clear, must have been very like the joy the makers felt when their moon pointer first sped and slowed correctly. That same deep human satisfaction of a hard thing brought right, felt now across 2,000 years by people working on opposite ends of the same puzzle. There is a lovely symmetry in that, the ancient makers and the modern investigators, separated by 2 millennia, bent over the same object in the same spirit, and I like to hold the two of them together in my mind, the lamplit workshop and the humming laboratory, both of them full of people refusing to leave a beautiful problem unsolved. Let me now do something we have not yet done, which is to imagine, slowly and in detail, what it would actually have been like to use the machine, to sit down with it when it was new and whole and turn its handle, because the surviving descriptions and the reconstructed gearing let us picture this with some confidence, and there are few more restful things than to imagine yourself into an ancient evening. So, it is evening in a Greek city in the last century before Christ. The lamps are lit. You are seated at a table, and before you stands the machine in its wooden case, about the size of a large book stood on its end, or a small mantel clock, the doors of the case closed. You open the doors. On the front face is the great round dial with its 2 rings of markings, the zodiac and the calendar, and its pointers resting where you last left them. You have a question, let us say. You wish to know the phase of the moon on a certain night some months hence, perhaps because you are planning a journey and wish to travel by moonlight, or planning a festival, or simply curious. So you take hold of the little handle on the side of the case, and you begin, gently, to turn it. And as you turn, the pointers move. The sun pointer creeps along the zodiac. The moon pointer moves faster, racing ahead, and in its little window the painted ball turns, showing you the moon growing and shrinking, silver waxing to full and dwindling to dark, and swelling again, month by month as you wind the handle forward. You watch the calendar scale, turning the handle until the date you care about comes up under the sun pointer. And then you look at the moon, at the little half-lit ball, and there is your answer, the shape the moon will show on that future night, told to you in bronze by a machine that has calculated it from the turning of its own wheels. And if you are curious about more, you close the front and consider the back, with its 2 great spirals, and you see where the eclipse pointer has crept to along its coil, and you read, at the marked points, the little glyphs that tell you an eclipse is due, and whether of the sun or the moon, and roughly when. And you can wind forward and watch the pointer approach the next eclipse mark, and know that on that night, years away, the moon will darken and perhaps turn red, and on the small dial you can read which of the great games falls in the coming years, when the athletes will gather. All of this from the turning of one handle, all of this knowledge, the moon and the sun and the eclipses and the calendar and the games, folded into a box on your table and unfolded again by the motion of your hand. Now imagine the feeling of it. Imagine being a person of that age, in a world without any of the instruments and references we take so utterly for granted, and holding in your hands a device that could tell you the future of the sky. It must have seemed very close to magic, and yet it was not magic, it was knowledge, hard-won human knowledge, the accumulated watching of centuries geared down into bronze, and the person who understood that this was not sorcery but science, must have felt something we can still feel, a kind of sober exhilaration at what the human mind can do, at the reach of it, at the way patient thought can lay hold of the very heavens and bring them, tamed and turnable, down onto a table in a lamplit room. That feeling, I think, is a large part of what the machine was for, whatever its practical uses, and it is a feeling worth carrying with you towards sleep, the wonder of a mind that could do this. The wonder that is your own inheritance, for you are the descendant, the heir, of exactly those watchers and thinkers and makers, and the same capacity is in you. Sleeping now as you sleep. Now I want to circle back, because we have come a long way, and it is worth gathering ourselves, to the sheer improbability of the survival, because the more you know about the machine, the more improbable its survival becomes. And there is a strange comfort in improbability, in the sense of how nearly this was all lost, how thin the thread was by which it came to us. Consider everything that had to happen. The machine had to be made in the first place, which required the whole vanished tradition we have been mourning. Then it had to be aboard that particular ship, on that particular voyage. Then the ship had to sink, which, from the point of view of the machine's survival, was the necessary catastrophe. Because had the ship arrived safely, and the machine passed into the study of some Roman collector, it would almost certainly have been melted down for its bronze long ago, as nearly every other ancient bronze object was, recycled into coins or statues or fittings, its knowledge scattered, its gears returned to the crucible. Bronze does not survive above ground. It is too valuable. It gets melted. The only ancient bronzes that survive in any number are the ones that were lost, buried, sunk, put beyond the reach of the recyclers, and so, paradoxically, the sinking of the ship, the disaster that drowned the sailors and lost the cargo, is the very thing that saved the machine, hiding it on the sea floor where no one could melt it down, preserving it, corroded but present, through all the centuries when it would otherwise have been destroyed. And then the wreck had to lie undisturbed for 2,000 years, and then it had to be found, and to be found it needed the sponge divers, and the storm that blew them there, and the deep-diving suits that let them reach it, and the curiosity of the captain, and the honesty that sent him to the authorities, and the young Greek state's willingness to fund a recovery, and the divers' courage in going down to that dangerous depth, some of them at the cost of their health, and one at the cost of his life. And then, having been brought up, the lump had to not be discarded as a worthless piece of ship's fitting, and it had to dry and split and reveal its gear, and someone had to recognise the gear for what it was, against all expectation, and then the fragments had to survive another half-century of well-meaning but limited study without being destroyed, until the tools existed to read them properly. Every one of those steps could have gone the other way. At every point the machine could have been lost, melted, discarded, overlooked, destroyed, and we would never have known it existed. We'd be sitting here tonight in a world that believed, comfortably and wrongly, that the ancient Greeks did not have gears and could not build machines. The whole of our knowledge of this astonishing chapter of human achievement hangs on a chain of accidents and choices any one of which could have broken. And there is one accident in that chain that deserves a special word, because it is the strangest and most paradoxical of all, and it is the corrosion itself, the green ruin that both destroyed the machine and saved it. Think about it. The corrosion is the enemy. It is the slow chemistry of the sea eating away at the bronze, swelling it, cracking it, dissolving its fine detail, turning a bright, precise instrument into a green and crumbling lump. It destroyed perhaps 2/3 of the machine outright, and it fused what remained into a mass so dense and confused that it took a century and the invention of 3-dimensional X-ray imaging to see inside it. The corrosion is why we have so little, and why understanding even that little was so hard. And yet the corrosion is also, in a way, the reason we have anything at all, because it was the corrosion, the crust of hard sea deposit, and the products of the bronze's own decay that sealed the fragments, that held them together, that protected the surviving gears and the surviving inscriptions from being scattered and lost entirely. The tiny engraved letters that we can read today survive because they were locked inside the corrosion, preserved in the very substance that was slowly consuming them, like an insect in amber, destroyed and saved by the same thing. There is a deep and almost unsettling lesson in that, about how the forces that ruin a thing and the forces that preserve it can be the very same forces, about how loss and survival are so often braided together that you cannot have the one without the other. The machine survived because the ship was lost. Its inscription survived because the bronze corroded. Its story reaches us wrapped in the very disasters that nearly erased it, and I do not fully know what to make of that, except to sit with it, in the dark, as one of those large, true, strange things that the mechanism keeps offering up to anyone who contemplates it long enough. The whole of our knowledge of this astonishing chapter of human achievement, then, hangs not only on a chain of accidents and choices, but on this deeper paradox, that the enemy was also the guardian, that the sea that killed the sailors kept the machine, that the corrosion that ate the bronze preserved the words. And I find, lying in the dark and thinking about that it fills me not with anxiety but with a kind of gratitude. A gratitude for the machine's improbable survival, and, beyond that, a gratitude for survival itself. For the sheer unlikely fact that anything at all comes down to us across the enormous gulf of time, that we are not entirely cut off from the people who came before, that now and then, by some fluke of preservation, a voice reaches us from 2,000 years away and tells us that they were cleverer and stranger and more like us than we had any right to expect. Let me take you back once more to the seafloor, because the story of the wreck did not end with that first recovery in 1901 and 1902, and the later chapters are worth knowing, both for their own sake and because they carry a small hope for the future of the mystery. The wreck off Antikythera has been visited again, more than once, in the decades since, as diving technology has improved and as the archaeologists have come to appreciate that a site so rich might still hold more. The famous underwater explorer Jacques Cousteau dived the wreck in the middle of the 20th century and brought up more material, coins and fragments and pieces of the cargo. And in our own century, teams of archaeologists using the most advanced diving equipment that lets them stay at that depth far longer and far more safely than the sponge divers ever could, have returned to the site and mapped it carefully and recovered more statuary, more of the ship's fittings, the personal possessions of the people aboard, even, poignantly, human remains, the bones of someone who went down with the ship, lying still in the sand after 2,000 years. And the quiet hope that hangs over all this later work, is that somewhere on that seafloor, in the sand, under the shifting deposits, there may be more of the machine, more fragments, perhaps pieces that would fill in the gaps in our understanding. That would show us the planetary gearing we can only infer. That would settle the arguments about exactly how the whole thing was arranged. The 2/3 that is missing may not all have dissolved into the sea. Some of it may still be there, waiting, as the whole machine once waited, for someone to come and lift it into the light. And I find that a lovely thought to end the deep part of our night on, the thought that this story is not finished, that the sea may still be holding, in its dark and patient way, more pieces of the puzzle, and that some future diver, in some future year, may bring up out of that same deep water a green and corroded fragment that turns out, when the new instruments of that later age are turned upon it, to hold another gear, another dial, another small green sentence in the machine's long interrupted account of itself. The mystery is not closed. The sea keeps its own counsel and its own timetable, and it has surprised us before, and it may surprise us again. There is one part of the machine I have deliberately kept lightly veiled, because the honest state of our knowledge about it is uncertain, and uncertainty is the natural home of this whole story, and I want now to draw the veil back a little and let you rest in the uncertainty itself. Which is, I think, one of the most peaceful things this object has to offer. I mean the planets. I have said, in passing, that the machine probably modelled the 5 wandering stars, the 5 planets the ancients knew, and that there is reason to think so from the surviving text and from the gaps in the gearing where wheels are lost. But I have been careful not to describe the planetary gearing in detail, because, unlike the moon gearing and the eclipse gearing, which survive well enough to be understood with confidence, the planetary part of the machine is very largely lost, and what it was and how it worked is a matter of reconstruction and inference and reasoned argument rather than of direct evidence. And this is worth dwelling on, because the planets were, for the ancient astronomers, by far the hardest problem in the sky. The sun moves smoothly through the year. The moon is more complicated, hurrying and dawdling, but still in the end tractable. But the planets, the wandering stars, are a genuine nightmare of irregularity. They move through the zodiac, yes, but not steadily. And worse, every so often each of them appears to stop, and reverse, and travel backward across the sky for a time, and then stop again, and resume its forward course, tracing a strange looping path that baffled the watchers of the ancient world for centuries. This backward wandering, this apparent reversal, is one of the most puzzling things the naked eye can see in the heavens, and explaining it, modelling it, capturing it, was the supreme challenge of ancient astronomy, the problem on which the finest minds broke themselves for generations. And there are hints, tantalising hints in the inscriptions and in the lost gearing of the Antikythera mechanism, that its makers attempted this too, that they tried to build into their bronze box not only the smooth sun and the hurrying moon, but the looping, reversing, maddening dance of the 5 planets. And if they did, if they truly geared the planets and their backward wanderings into that machine, then it was an achievement of almost unthinkable sophistication, and it is heartbreaking that just this part, the most ambitious part, is the part most thoroughly lost. Scholars have proposed reconstructions, ingenious schemes of gearing that would produce the planetary motions, and some of them are very beautiful and very plausible, and they may well be right, but we cannot be sure, because the wheels themselves are gone, dissolved into the sea or crushed to nothing, or still lying in the sand off the island. So here, at the very summit of the machine's ambition, we reach the edge of our knowledge and must stop, and stand at the edge and look out into the uncertainty, and I find that a strangely fitting place to stand. The machine keeps its deepest secrets still. The part of it that reached highest is the part we can see least, and perhaps that is right. Perhaps some ambition should remain veiled. Perhaps it is good for us to have, at the heart of this story, a thing we genuinely do not know and may never know, locked in a room in a house we have otherwise mapped. It keeps the mystery alive. It keeps us humble. And it means that when I tell you the machine modelled the planets, I am telling you something we hope and believe but cannot prove. And there is a lovely honesty in saying so plainly, in resisting the temptation to pretend to more certainty than we have. The planets of the Antikythera mechanism are a rumour, a beautiful rumour, supported by good evidence but not confirmed, and they will remain so unless the sea gives up more of its pieces, and there is peace in leaving them there, in the half-light, unresolved. Now let me set the machine, for a while, in its proper company, because there is a temptation, when you first meet the Antikythera mechanism, to think of it as utterly alone, a single impossible object with nothing around it, and while that is nearly true, it is not quite true, and the near misses, the other clever things the ancient world made, are worth walking through, both because they are wonderful in themselves, and because they help us see just how and why the mechanism stands so far above them. Consider, first, the ordinary genius of the ancient world, the genius everyone agrees on. The Greeks and the Romans built aqueducts that carried water across whole countries on a gradient so gentle it can hardly be measured, dropping a few inches over a mile. Engineered by hand and eye and patient surveying to a precision that still astonishes engineers today. They built domes and vaults and roads and harbours. They raised temples whose columns lean by fractions of a degree to correct for the tricks the eye plays at that scale. They moved and lifted and shaped stone in quantities and to a fineness that we would find challenging even now. All of this is well known, and none of it is mysterious in the way the mechanism is mysterious, because all of it leaves a paper trail, a tradition, a lineage of works, each building on the last. The aqueducts have their manuals and their named engineers. The temples have their architects and their described methods. These are peaks, but they are peaks in a mountain range, connected to the ground by visible slopes, and you can trace how the knowledge grew and spread and was handed down. The mechanism is different because it has almost no slopes, almost no range around it. It stands nearly alone, and that is the heart of its strangeness. But let us look at the few things that do stand somewhere near it, the ancient devices that reach, if not to its height, then at least in its direction. There were, in the ancient world, ingenious automata, mechanical toys and temple wonders, made by clever inventors, especially in the great city of learning in Egypt, where a tradition of mechanical invention flourished. There were devices that used steam and air and water to produce startling effects, doors that seemed to open by themselves, figures that moved, birds that sang by means of hidden air and water, vessels that dispensed a measure of wine when a coin was dropped in, the ancestor, if you like, of the vending machine. There were water clocks of great sophistication, devices that measured the passing hours by the steady flow or drip of water, some of them fitted with dials and pointers, and even, in the grandest examples, with figures that moved to mark the hours. And there is a real kinship between these water clocks with their dials and pointers and the Antikythera mechanism, a shared world of gearing and indication and the mechanical marking of time. And some scholars think the tradition that produced the mechanism grew, in part out of the tradition that produced the finest water clocks, the astronomical knowledge married to the clockmaker's craft. So the mechanism is not quite without cousins. But here is the thing, and it is worth saying clearly. None of these cousins, marvellous as they are, approaches the mechanism in one particular quality, which is the density and subtlety of its information. A singing bird is a wonder of ingenuity, but it tells you nothing about the cosmos. A water clock marks the hours, which is a real and valuable thing, but the hours are a simple matter beside the wandering of 5 planets, and the varying speed of the moon and the long cycles of the eclipses. The Antikythera mechanism is not merely a clever machine, it is a clever machine that has been made to carry an enormous burden of hard-won astronomical knowledge, to embody the distilled results of centuries of watching the sky, and that is what sets it apart. That is what makes it not just an example of ancient ingenuity, but a thing that reaches beyond its age. It is the difference between a music box, which is charming, and a working model of the solar system, which is a kind of miracle. And when you have set the mechanism among its cousins and seen how it towers over them, you come back, always, to the same 2 feelings, the wonder that it was made at all, and the sorrow that the tradition capable of making it did not survive to make more. There is a phrase people sometimes reach for, when they meet the mechanism, the phrase out of its time, and it is a good phrase. An evocative phrase, but I want to handle it with a little care, because it can mislead. The mechanism was not, of course, actually out of its time. It was made squarely within its own time by people of its own time, using the knowledge and the tools of its own time. It only seems out of its time to us, because we had formed in advance a picture of what its time was capable of, and the picture was too small, and the mechanism broke it. And that, I think, is the real lesson of the phrase, not that the ancients somehow reached forward into a later age and stole its technology, which is nonsense, but that our picture of the ancient world was, and probably still is, too modest, that they were capable of more than we credited them with, that the past was richer and stranger and cleverer than our tidy story allowed. The mechanism is not a message from the future misfiled in the past. It is a correction to our underestimate of the past, and every time I contemplate it, I feel gently rebuked for all the ways we condescend to the people who came before us, imagining them simpler than they were, when the truth is that they were as clever as we are, only with different tools and different knowledge, and capable, now and then, of things that leave us humbled. I said earlier that the early scholars, the ones who first met the fragments, could not at first accept what they were seeing, that some insisted the thing must be an intrusion, something modern fallen into the wreck, because the alternative, that the ancient Greeks had built a geared calculating machine, was simply too much to believe. And I want to return to that for a moment, because there is a quiet vindication in it that I find deeply satisfying, and it is a vindication not of any one person, but of the object itself, of the truth of it, against all the confident disbelief that met it. Imagine the position of the scholar who first argued, firmly, that the fragments were genuinely ancient, genuinely a geared machine, genuinely the work of Greek hands before the birth of Christ. Imagine the resistance he faced, the raised eyebrows, the colleagues who thought him credulous, taken in, seeing what he wished to see. Everything the learned world thought it knew stood against him. And yet he was right, and the object was patient, and the decades passed, and the X-rays came, and then the 3-dimensional imaging, and piece by piece, tooth by tooth, inscription by inscription, the impossible thing proved itself real, until at last no honest person could deny it. There was no triumphant moment, no single day of vindication, because the proof came slowly, as everything in this story comes slowly, over generations, each new instrument and each new study adding its weight to the truth. But the truth won, in the end, not by argument but by sheer accumulating evidence, the object quietly insisting on what it was until the world had no choice but to believe it. And there is something in that I find steadying. The way the truth of a thing, if it is truly true, will wait, will not be hurried, will not shout, but will go on being true through all the disbelief, until the disbelief exhausts itself, and the truth is simply, quietly, there. The mechanism did not need anyone to believe in it. It was what it was, geared and inscribed and ancient, whether anyone accepted it or not, and it waited, with its 2,000-year patience, for the world to catch up to it. And the world did. That is a comforting shape for a truth to have, and a comforting thing to rest in as the night deepens. Let me go back, one more time, to the wreck and its other treasures, because I have kept the focus so tightly on the machine that I have shortchanged the rest of the ship, and the rest of the ship has its own quiet claims on our attention, and they make good company for the last stretch of the night. Remember that the machine was not the only thing that came up out of that sea, that it was, in fact, the least regarded of the finds at the time, overshadowed entirely by the sculptures. And those sculptures are worth a moment. There was the bronze figure of a young man, life-size and more, one of the finest bronzes to survive from the whole of antiquity, standing with an arm raised, his face calm and beautiful and turned a little to the side, so lifelike after 2,000 years in the sea that people who see him in the museum sometimes fall silent. There were marble figures, many of them, some almost destroyed by the sea, eaten and pitted where the creatures of the deep had worked at them, so that they seem half-melted, ghostly, as though the sea had begun to take them back into itself and been interrupted. There was a bronze head of a philosopher, bearded, deeply lined, wonderfully characterful. The face of a man who thought hard about difficult things, and it is tempting, though there is no evidence for it, to imagine some connection between that thoughtful bronze face and the thoughtful bronze machine that travelled in the same hold. There was jewellery, and fine glass, and pottery, and the everyday gear of the ship and its people, and there were, as I mentioned, human remains, recovered in the more recent dives, the bones of at least one person who went down with the ship and never came up, lying in the sand among the treasures for 2,000 years. I find those bones the most affecting thing of all, more even than the machine, because they remind us that this was not, in its own moment, a treasure trove or an archaeological site or a wonder of the ancient world. It was a shipwreck. It was a disaster. Real people, sailors and perhaps passengers, died in that storm, drowned in the dark water off the island, their voyage ended, their lives ended, in terror and cold. The beautiful sculptures and the miraculous machine that we prize so highly were, to them, simply the cargo they died alongside, and the sea that preserved these things for us is the same sea that killed them. There is a solemnity in that which I do not want to pass over, a reminder that our wonders are often built on someone else's catastrophe, that the machine survived because the ship was lost, that the door into the ancient world that this wreck opened for us was, for the people aboard, the door closing on everything. And I think the right response to that is not to feel less wonder at the machine, but to hold the wonder and the solemnity together, to be grateful for what the sea preserved and mindful of what it cost. To remember, when we marvel at the bronze heavens turning under our imagined hand, that a real person's hands once turned them, and that person and the sailors who carried the machine went down into the dark and did not return. The machine is a marvel, and it is also a memorial, and both of those things are true at once, and holding them together is part of what it means to contemplate it honestly. Let us turn, as the night deepens toward its quietest hour, to the largest question of all, the one that sits underneath all the others, the question that a device like this cannot help but raise in any mind that contemplates it long enough. Why did they make it? Not what did it do, we have covered that, but why? What was it for? In the deeper sense, in the human sense, what did it mean to the people who made it and owned it and turned its handle in the lamplight. And here we pass beyond what the gears and the inscriptions can tell us, and into something more like meditation, and I want to offer you a few thoughts to rest among, not as answers, for there are no certain answers here, but as company for the mind as it drifts. One answer, the plainest, is that it was a tool, a practical instrument for knowing the calendar and predicting the eclipses and keeping track of the cycles, and there is surely truth in that. In a world without printed almanacs, without the endless reference material we take for granted, a device that could tell you the phase of the moon on a future date, or warn you of a coming eclipse, or keep the drifting calendar in order, would have real practical value, especially to anyone whose work or worship depended on the heavens, priests, astronomers, those who set the dates of festivals. So part of the answer is use. But I do not think use is the whole of it, or even the heart of it, and here is why. The machine is far more elaborate than mere use requires. You do not need to correct for the fine unevenness of the moon's motion to know roughly when the next full moon will be. You do not need a little dial of the Olympic Games to run your life. The machine goes far beyond the practical, into a kind of completeness, a desire to include everything, to model the whole of the heavens and the whole of time as fully and as beautifully as the craft would allow. And that, I think, points to a second and deeper answer, which is that the machine was made for wonder, that it was, at least in part, an object of contemplation and delight, a way of holding the cosmos in the hand and marvelling at it, a physical embodiment of the Greek conviction, one of the most beautiful convictions any people ever held, that the universe is orderly, that it moves according to number and proportion, that the apparent chaos of the wandering planets and the drifting moon conceals a deep and knowable regularity, and that the human mind, by patience and mathematics, can uncover that regularity and even reproduce it, mirror it, in a made thing of bronze and reason. The Antikythera mechanism is, in this light, not merely a calculator but a statement of faith, a faith in the order of the cosmos and in the power of the mind to grasp it, and turning its handle was not merely a practical act, but almost a devotional one. A participation in the very order it modelled, the human hand setting the little bronze heavens in motion in imitation of whatever hand, or law, or reason, set the great real heavens in motion overhead. And there is, I think, a third answer, quieter than the other two, and it is the one I find myself resting in most easily as sleep comes near. Perhaps the machine was made, in part, simply because it could be. Because someone, some maker or some school of makers, had reached a point of skill and knowledge where such a thing became possible, and having glimpsed the possibility could not rest until it was made, out of that pure and disinterested delight in difficulty overcome that is one of the finest things in human nature. The same impulse that drives people to climb mountains and prove theorems and build cathedrals, the impulse to do a hard and beautiful thing for no better reason than that it is hard and beautiful and can be done. I like to imagine the makers in that light, not as tradesmen filling an order, though they may have been that too, but as people caught up in the joy of a great problem, working late by lamplight, cutting the tiny teeth, testing the ratios, watching with satisfaction as the moon pointer at last sped and slowed just as the real moon does, feeling the deep contentment of a difficult thing brought right. And if that is any part of the truth, then the machine is a monument not only to Greek astronomy, but to something more universal and more tender, to the human love of making, the love of getting a hard thing exactly right, a love that reaches across the 2,000 years between us and them and joins us to them more surely than any inscription, because it is a love we still feel. Every time we labour over something difficult for the pure pleasure of doing it well. Let me draw the threads together now, gently, as the night settles toward its close, because we have wandered far and it is good to gather ourselves before we let go. We began with a storm, and a sponge diver wight with fear at the sight of the dead on the seafloor, who turned out to be the sculpted dead of 2,000 years before. We followed the recovery, the brave and costly work of the divers, the wonderful hall of statues, and, set aside, and almost overlooked, the corroded lump that split to reveal a gear. We watched the slow century of understanding, the long neglect, the pioneering X-rays, the modern instruments that finally read the machine's inner secrets and its tiny inscriptions. And we saw what the machine did, the sun and moon and planets on its front, the moon even speeding and slowing to match the real moon, the great spiral dials of the calendar and eclipse cycles on its back, the eclipses foretold to the hour and the colour, the little civic dial that tracked the Olympic Games. We stood with the wonder of it, a geared computer of the cosmos built 2,000 years ago, and with the sadness of it, a whole tradition of knowledge and craft reaching back to Archimedes, of which this is nearly the only survivor, a peak of achievement reached, and then lost so completely that its very existence was doubted. We wondered about the ship and its cargo of plundered art, and about the machine's forgotten owner, and about who made it and where, and we let the great questions stand unanswered, because they are more restful unanswered, and because some of them have no answers we will ever have. And we asked at the last why and found not one answer but three: use and wonder and the pure love of making, and rested among them. And now, at the end, I want to bring you back to the simplest image of all, the one to carry down into sleep. Somewhere, in the last century before Christ, in a Greek city whose name we may never certainly know, a person sat at a table in the lamplight and turned a small handle on the side of a bronze box. And as they turned it, the sun crept along the zodiac, and the moon swelled and shrank in its little window, silver and then dark. And the pointer felt its way along the spiral toward the next eclipse, and the whole quiet mechanism of the heavens moved under their hand, wheel within wheel, in obedience to numbers that the makers had found in the sky and hidden in the teeth of the gears. And then, one way or another, in a storm or in a lifetime, that person set the machine down for the last time, and it went into the sea, and the darkness closed over it, and it turned no more for 2,000 years. And it lay there, in the cold and the dark and the silence, off the little island, while the empires rose and fell overhead on the surface of the world, while Rome fell and the long centuries turned and everything the makers knew was forgotten. And it kept its gears and its inscriptions and its patient record of the heavens sealed in its corrosion, waiting, the way the moon waits to be full again, the way the eclipse waits its long cycle round, the way all the slow certain cycles of the sky that the machine was built to honour go on turning, whether or not anyone is watching, whether or not anyone remembers, whether or not anyone is left to turn the handle. And then the storm blew the sponge boat off its course, and the pale diver went down, and the sky came back up out of the sea. So if you are still with me, here at the very edge of sleep, let that be the last thing in your mind, the little bronze heavens turning under a forgotten hand 2,000 years ago, and the same real heavens turning now, tonight, outside your window, over your roof, the same moon in the same slow rhythm, the same eclipses waiting their patient turn, the same order the makers loved and modelled and could not quite keep. Nothing needs solving tonight. The machine kept its secret for 2,000 years and gave it up only a piece at a time, and it is still keeping some of it. And that is all right. That is as it should be. Some things are meant to be turned over slowly, in the dark, without any hurry toward an answer, the way you turn a smooth stone in your pocket, the way the great wheel turns the small, the way sleep itself comes, not all at once, but gently, gear by gear, until the handle stops, and the pointers rest, and the long night keeps its own quiet counsel over the sleeping world. Rest now. The heavens will keep turning without us for a while. They are very good at it. They have had a great deal of practice. And the little bronze machine, wherever its pieces lie tonight, in a museum case in Athens and perhaps still in the sand of the sea, has taught us the one thing it most has to teach, which is how to wait, and how to keep faith with an order we cannot fully see, and how to let a question be beautiful without needing it to be answered. Before you go all the way under, let me leave one small thing turning gently in your mind, not a question to answer tonight, just a thought to carry down with you into sleep, and perhaps to turn over some other evening. When you think of this machine, of the whole long story of it, I wonder which part stays with you the most. Is it the wonder of the making, the astonishing fact that people 2,000 years ago could gather the watching of centuries and gear it down into bronze and hold the heavens in their hands? Or is it the sorrow of the losing, the fact that they could do this and then the knowledge slipped away, thread by thread, until the world forgot it had ever been possible? The wonder or the sorrow? I do not think there is a right answer, and I do not think you have to choose, for the truth is that they are the same thing seen from two sides, the height and the fall, the door opening and the door closing, and perhaps the deepest peace of all comes from holding them both at once, gently, without needing to decide. That is what the machine does. If you let it, it holds the wonder and the sorrow together and asks you to hold them too. And there is rest in that, a strange deep rest, the rest of a mind that has stopped struggling to sort everything into wonder or sorrow, right or wrong, solved or unsolved, and has simply let the whole beautiful complicated thing be what it is. And speaking of what waits to be turned over on another evening, there are other sleepers in the sand of the past that we will visit in the weeks to come, other objects that came up out of the earth or the water carrying questions no one could answer, other quiet mysteries to keep us company by the lamp. So if this one has soothed you, there will be another waiting, and another after that, for the past is very deep and very patient, and it has more puzzles than we could exhaust in 100 nights. But that is for another time. For now there is only this, the little bronze heavens, and the real ones turning overhead, and the slow certain cycles that go on whether or not anyone watches. Rest now. Let the handle in your own mind slow, and stop. Let the pointers come to rest. Let the wheels grow still. The heavens will keep turning without you, as they have for all the ages, as they did through the 2,000 years the machine lay sleeping in the sea, and they will be there in the morning, the same sun climbing the same zodiac, the same moon somewhere in its round, patient and exact, and yours to wonder at again whenever you wake. Sleep well. Good night.